So this is the final video that I would like to do in terms of this little range of jazz skills, and as I have said, there will be a course coming out which is far more detailed and professionally recorded with PDFs and all sorts of stuff like that, which we're going to be producing sort of hopefully in September. That will come out. The final bit I wanted to talk about really is what I would call the alchemical process of how this comes out into your own kind of like style, because all of these techniques, I've presented as kind of separate entities, and the question is really the extraordinary mystery of how you actually then improvise and come up with lots of ideas and even move into kind of completely new sort of areas of improvisation that you weren't expecting. Now, I've done a lot of research on this, as in I did an MPhil, a master's thesis, on the work of John Coltrane and the concept of truth, and this was something that Coltrane was really interested in, the idea of, always moving towards what you feel is truthful as a musician. And that led him, as any of you know who have sort of followed his trajectory, his life story, through a whole sequence of kind of different kind of layers of musical development, and doing an extraordinary job really of following that very kind of like, with a great deal of integrity or truthfulness, all the way through to its sort of logical outcome. And as a result, sort of losing sort of, listeners on the way, but, gaining this extraordinary, reputation until he's ended up with his own church named after him. But, his concept of truth is a really interesting thing to study. My PhD was then over 7 years looking at the concept of spirituality in jazz. And here I'm really talking in terms of spirituality simply about the kind of invisible elements of what goes into playing. I'm not trying to sort of like, I was never looking really necessarily at religious content or things like that, but certainly the kind of like the intangible sort of quality that makes you, drawn to certain kind of like sounds and solos and approaches, not the chord scale mechanics of it, but the other kind of factors that go along it. And a lot of jazz musicians, do feel there was a great spiritual element to what they're doing, that they are genuinely sort of channeling stuff. Others are more kind of like, I suppose, less sort of, kind of like spiritual about what they think they're doing. They're much more sort of like analytical about the sort of process. But all of them, certainly within the research I've done, there is a sort of mysterious element. And having, again, taught jazz for like 30 years at this university, there is a bit where I can't help, as in certain, when students say, well, how does it sort of like come into this kind of like jazz language? The answer is there is a bit where your mind and your kind of maybe your soul, your spirit, whatever you want to call it, unconscious, subconscious, but has to take all of these elements and mixed in with all the kind of musical influences, maybe, and artistic influences as well, that you've kind of like listened to and absorbed, slowly develops into a kind of like a style or an approach which is very personal to you. And that's the bit that no one can really do on your behalf. That's something that you do yourself. Now, there is, however, kind of like the idea of how we actually get into that sort of flow state. So, for example, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi did this research on flow, and I do believe that is how you pronounce his name. I have looked it up. The flow state is, something that's a global sort of phenomena, from golfers to mountaineers to jazz musicians to painters to scientists. This bit where you actually kind of enter into a sort of zone where you are kind of like transported away from the usual sort of clock time into something much kind of like more transfigured or sort of transcendent, some people would call it. Inspired, where you are able to sort of, again, sort of channel ideas into something that actually feels kind of new and interesting and fresh from all of the kind of discrete sort of elements of jazz that you learn, from the licks to the riffs to the scales to the chords, you know, all of this kind of stuff. There's a bit where you have to kind of let go and just play. I find this is one of the reasons why that you should always try to play with groups. If you can get out and play live and play with bands, it forces you into kind of like a particular mindset where you just have to kind of play. And too many people, I think, often get into a trap of just staying in practice rooms trying to get this stuff done. But I think it should always be complemented by live playing. And playing with groups that sort of push you to sort of like find your voice. I did that actually literally this year. I got together with 2 really talented students simply because I was actually struggling with my own sort of like trio playing, and actually spent every single week spending a good hour and a half rehearsing with them, just jamming basically, because I wasn't doing enough of it and I really felt like my playing was quite stuck. I was doing too much sort of individual playing and not enough, and it was really helpful. So I would always advise that. Now, the person that's kind of cornered the market on the sort of spiritual aspect, I suppose, of jazz is Kenny Werner. And the book Effortless Mastery, he's obviously done a huge amount. There's loads of stuff now on YouTube. He has written a further book on Effortless Mastery, a kind of follow-up to it not that long ago as well. But I personally, Effortless Mastery kind of says everything that needs to be said about the sort of general approach, and then there's some wonderful sort of masterclasses up on YouTube and stuff that he's done. His thing is, again, once you've learnt this stuff and it's under your muscle memory, so you can't get around the fact you've got to practice and get this stuff into your physical kind of like, and you know, mental being. And listening, you know, is really important, and listening to good jazz musicians, so your mind has got a kind of direction it's trying to move towards. But there's a point where you have to kind of just let go. And his exercises, I think, are very, very good at the end of the book. I mean, he does it on the piano with this kind of finger dropping exercise initially. And the idea of just getting into a very, very kind of like empty sort of state where all you're doing is just dropping your finger on the piano. And he does do this with other instruments. And I do a video on this actually on the YouTube called The Zone, I think it is, from another thing I was doing a couple of years ago. But basically, he comes up with a series of things to get you used to just playing your instrument without judging what you're doing, and actually getting into a sort of state that gets away from anxiety and constantly monitoring everything you're doing, and into a state that's much more receptive to what actually kind of wants to happen within the kind of flow state. Now again, you can't do that unless you've done the practice and put the work in, but somewhere down the line you have to kind of learn to sort of access this sort of this flow state. You'll notice different jazz musicians kind of do this almost like from a physical sort of pattern, from how Lester Young, for example, plays his saxophone, to how Bill Evans, as you watch his performance, slowly he will move further and further, you know, until he's literally down here on the piano and his breathing pattern changes. And you want to kind of find your own way of doing this. I love watching a lot of the jazz guitarists and the different kind of positions that they get into again once they're really sort of like going for it. And if you can learn to sort of access that state, that's where the kind of music comes. The second you start questioning what you're doing or thinking, is that person impressed with what I'm doing, you know, the flow state is blocks and it's gone. So you have to learn basically to sort of access this and get rid of the sort of ego that's saying, no, you should be doing something much more flashy here or whatever. You know, it might be just at the right point. There's a load of flashy things that you can do that's absolutely right, but there might be other points where it's not. And you have to learn to basically sort of let go. And I think Brad Meldell he did an interview, and I think this is where I got it from, but someone asked him about, you know, how much of this stuff, they often say that you're supposed to, everything that you play, you should be able to hear. And I think it was him who said that's not necessarily true. He said that a lot of it he does sort of like have particular ideas and thematic ideas that he's quite genuinely hearing, and then there are certain points where he is kind of like moving much more from a physical sort of point of view, and it sort of goes up and down between kind of like a particular sort of inspiration into the thing, and then at certain points you can't monitor all of this all the time as sort of constantly singing through your instrument. I think it was him. If it wasn't, I apologise, but I'm pretty positive. But I feel that sounds actually about right, because I think the idea of constantly playing melodies that you can hear is actually very, very difficult. There is a sort of idea of if you sing the solo, da 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 da, you know, like singing with your instrument is a really good idea. Obviously not with a saxophone because you're sort of doing that anyway, or trumpet or trombone. But it's a nice idea. But I also think there is room for kind of like these. Well, weirdly, Kenny Werner does the opposite to an extent and says you should actually be watching your hands almost playing by themselves, almost as if it's someone else's hands, and you watch what they want to do. So, and makes sense anyway because the mind and the body are two sort of interconnected entities. It's not like there's two separate things. So I think this is another thing to sort of think about, is not to worry too much necessarily about constantly sort of singing through your instrument and doing, but actually sort of allowing a process of what wants to happen as it's happening. And as I say, Kenny Werner is a really good sort of place to start if you want to read that. Jean-Michel Pilk wrote a very good book along similar lines called It's About the Music, which I thought was very interesting, again, about the kind of psychology of actually, or the process of sort of improvising in that particular way. But I think what you need to always understand is there are these discrete skills like transcribing and learning the riffs and licks and scales and actually mastering the technique of your instrument. But there's this bit where you have to also understand the sort of psychology of getting into this performance state. And again, the more gigging you can do and playing, the better, and learning to sort of like just switch off and see what's happening and allowing the music to sort of take you where it's going. And this is, again, I think very much what Coltrane was trying to do with his kind of like idea around truth in music. So I hope that's helpful in some way. Thank you.